Welcome to Technovation. I'm Peter High. I'm pleased to welcome Rob Carter and Steve Randich to the broadcast. Rob is the Executive Vice President of FedEx Information Services and the Chief Information Officer of FedEx. Rob's been in his role for more than 2 decades across his nearly 30 years with the company. Steve is the Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer of FINRA, a non-governmental organization that regulates member brokerage firms and exchange markets, such as the New York Stock Exchange. Prior to joining FINRA, Steve held CIO roles at Citibank, NASDAQ, and the Chicago Stock Exchange. In this interview, we discuss the role of technology in creating a nimble enterprise. Rob shares the story of how technology that once provided FedEx with its competitive advantage had become outdated, and the massive effort the company undertook to overhaul and modernize its legacy technology. Steve discusses the benefits of being an early adopter of the cloud, how FINRA is pushing up against the limits of Amazon Web Services, and FINRA's use of advanced analytics and machine learning to better identify fraud and bad actors. If you enjoy Technovation, please consider reading my new book, Getting to Nimble: How to Transform Your Company into a Digital Leader. The book is available on Amazon now or wherever else you buy books. As a special offer to our CXO listeners, if you purchase 50 or more books for you and for your team, I'd be happy to join you for a discussion on the book. To learn more, write us at info@metastrategy.com or visit gettingtonimble.com. This interview is recorded live during the MetaStrategy Digital Symposium on March 30th. Rob, Steve, it's so great to see you both. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, Peter, thank you.
Of course, yes. Rob, let me begin with you if I can. Yours is one of my favorite stories of the past decade. You have been in your role long enough that you have led and ushered in a full cycle in many areas of the technology, introducing technology that became kind of the crown jewels of the organization, and then got to the point where it was in need of modernization again, and had the humility to recognize when it was aging and when it needed replacement. You talked about how you recognized, in fact, that the crown jewels could be the source of the company's downfall if the organization didn't take corrective action accordingly. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that realization and the way in which you made the case to your board for a multi-year transformation of the technology of FedEx.
Yeah, our story was a little bit different, Peter, in that we had built almost all of our software from scratch. We had a custom-built estate of technology, both customer-facing and operational and back office, that frankly was serving us pretty well. I would also say that our team was by most measures a pretty elite team, and yet through the advent of time and technologies kind of crashing on the beach over the years, as well as acquisitions we had made, this estate had gotten messy. It had just climbed in time, cost, and complexity to deliver business value. And so all of that complexity was really causing me, as the technology leader in the enterprise, to look at the root causes. And what occurred to me was that we had too much stuff, and that we were going to have to build out new patterns and engineer new ways of doing business from an IT standpoint. And this was probably at the end of the decade of the 2000s, as we were getting ready to transition into the 2010s, and really just recognizing that that complexity was going to kill us. And so I literally went into Fred Smith's office, our CEO and founder, and said, "Fred, I'm going to fail." And he, has kind of caught his attention. He looked up and he said, "Well, pray do tell." And I said, "Look, we've got to begin to turn the ship here with regard to this technology estate we have. It's not broken, it's working. In fact, it's a feat of industrial engineering, how well it serves the business, but it's not going to serve us well in the future."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just very interesting. And I know you made the case to Fred, obviously successfully. You created this Hurricane Rob vision of a rudimentary picture of how the technology fit together and the problems in sustaining that, and then created a much cleaner picture about the core technologies that would take their place, ultimately getting Fred Smith's buy-in and the board's buy-in for this multi-year transformation. I'd love to come back to you in a moment to talk a little bit further about all that has entailed. Let me turn to Steve Randich. Steve, again, good to see you. FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, again, where you've been the CIO for about 8 years now, you have been on one of the most dramatic cloud transformations of any company, all the more meaningful given the amount of data that flows through your systems as the regulatory authority for the financial industry. And talk a bit about the rationale for as dramatic a move to the cloud as you chose to make in the grand scheme of things fairly early. Talk about the genesis of that, if you would.
Yeah, it was 2013, so it was definitely way ahead of the industry for financial services. The decision was made within 3 or 4 months of me coming to FINRA back in 2013. And it was really looking at how much data we have to process. We basically bring in all the equity and options, stock, trades, quotes, orders, pretty much every market event in the US we ingest every day. And those numbers, and back in that time frame, were approaching 50 to 100 billion per day. That number is now $500 billion. And our surveillance patterns look at very broad swaths of time over weeks and quarters. So we have to store all of that data, basically in tens and hundreds of petabytes accumulated. So when I came there, we were looking at massive volumes. We were running it on data warehouse appliances from EMC and IBM. But the reality was those couldn't provide the scale. We needed to move our architecture from vertical scaling to horizontal scaling. We looked at some supercomputers, which perfected, the vertical scaling, but we really needed a horizontal scaling architecture, and we needed massive scale at commodity costs. And that was really only going to be available in a cloud solution. So we very quickly moved to public cloud options and chose Amazon Web Services, and have had a great partnership over the last 8 years.
That's great. And just briefly, continuing with you just for a moment longer, Steve, you've in recent months reached such a volume that in some ways it's been really kind of pressing even the likes of an AWS to the limits of their capabilities. I'm wondering about some of the learnings from the volume changes that you've seen across the past year and how you've grappled with that.
Yeah, it's a little bit unsettling, but the reality is we are pushing up against the limits of Amazon Web Services. We never thought that would happen. You think of public cloud computing, particularly around the big cloud providers like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, as it being an unlimited amount of scale, right? Infinite scale. That we used to say that, right? We don't say that anymore because we found hard and soft limits within an AWS region, right? We are now moving towards multi-region. We got Amazon to support that, but that's largely from a disaster recovery standpoint and not a scaling standpoint. So we've identified dozens of bottlenecks within the Amazon infrastructure, and fortunately, we have regular meetings with Andy Jassy and some of the founding engineers to remove these bottlenecks, and we've been doing that for the last 6 months. So we've been making good progress, but it's something we never thought we'd have to walk down this road.
Perhaps they didn't either. Just given the remarkable volumes you're talking about. Rob, I'd like to go back to you, if I may. You were talking about this remarkable journey that you've been on, and the case that you needed to make to Fred Smith, to the board, to make really dramatic change. And as you contemplated that change, you focused on what you refer to as the 4 horsemen of dominant design. Take a moment and just describe those 4 horsemen, if you would, and the ways in which you've thought about those topics.
Well, Peter, when we were looking at all that complexity out there, and it looked like a hurricane, like you said. It was an amazing array of systems and interfaces that was frankly unsustainable for our future. So it forced me to start thinking in different ways about how do you engineer your way out of this. And for whatever reason, I was looking at the evolution of technologies across, many centuries, from the railroad to airlines to, to electricity. And what occurred to me was that every single one of those revolutions in civil society had resulted in a dominant design, that there was a dominant design notion that said, look, when the railroads first started, there were, significant different numbers of gauges of the railroad and ways that it worked. But over time, here in the US in particular, it settled on 4 foot 8.5 inches. You can take your tape measure out to the rail nearest your house and put it on there. Well, it wasn't always that way. It took a lot of time. And, the plug in the wall didn't always look exactly like it did today. There were competing formats. So early in the evolution of technologies that we all supported, everything was different. Everything was proprietary. Everything was unique, from compute to storage and data to networks to the way software was deployed. But the four horsemen across those four dimensions became really apparent to me that we were quickly moving away from this world of proprietary technologies into dominant design computing, where compute was going to be horizontal and scale out, and that you'd be able to tap into it, that storage and data was going to uniformly present itself as an asset to applications and compute, where networks had settled into IP technologies. From the varied, my first job out of college was as a DECnet administrator, and I had to broker the differences between all different kinds of networks that existed out there. And then maybe lastly, the software was going to become an as-a-service set of capabilities, the beginning of service-oriented architectures and API-based technologies. And so the focus shifted for us from building big vertical applications to building capabilities that would be able to tap into these various components of dominant design, and then therefore become.
Staying with you for a moment longer, Rob, if I may, your business is so remarkably diverse. You are an airline, you are a trucking company, a logistics company, an office services company, among other things that your business does, and traditionally had been operating in a federated way, understandably in many ways, given the diversity of the business. You've been thinking more now, and part of the journey you've been describing has been developing sort of some common cores, some common ways of doing things. And you're thinking more about what rhymes and developing a bit more collaboration across the traditional silos. Can you talk a bit about the rationale behind that and maybe some of the steps you've begun to undertake there?
I'm sure, like many of the attendees here, our business was diverse. We had different operating companies that we were serving, but it was really important. We had a strategic operating principle that said we would compete collectively, operate independently, and manage collaboratively. And so what we did was we really focused on that customer corridor, which allowed us to compete collectively as we began to establish the beachhead of these capabilities and technologies. And it worked out really well for us. But as we've evolved and as the world has evolved around us, we've changed those operating principles. They're now still compete collectively, but operate collaboratively and innovate digitally. I know that's just 6 words, but it's how we anchor our strategies in our corporation. And so operating collaboratively meant that we could thicken up that layer of capabilities for all of our operations and make many more common architectural decisions and capabilities decisions that could serve a solid core, but a flexible edge of operations out there around the world. So huge transformation for us, from a mindset and cultural standpoint, but it's, and also innovate digitally is really important to us. Our teams are really fired up to bring new kinds of capabilities to the logistical marketplaces.
That's a great story there. We appreciate you sharing that. I wanted to turn back to you, Steve. It's no doubt, given the amount of data that's flowing through your systems, that analytics are a very important part of what you do. And I know that you're in the developing stage of advanced analytics program. Talk a bit about the form that's taking and what you anticipate driving from it.
Yeah, so we just got a major initiative, 3-year initiative approved by our board a few weeks ago to really up our investment in advanced analytics and machine learning. Really what FINRA does, if you net it out, our IT operational issue is we get a ton of data and we have to find needles in the haystack in that data to find insider trading, market manipulation, and fraud. So our historical process was, using SQL to look at the data, specifically looking for specific evidence of things that we know about. But the problem is that the bad guys are smart and they continue to evolve and find new and better ways to get away with fraud. For example, they'll spread their activity across multiple exchanges or marketplaces, a little bit in each one, so that none of them actually trigger, an alert. So we have to get more sophisticated as well. And we've reached a point where we can't throw more humans at it. There's just too much to look at. And so we've got to get smart, and we got to make the machines smarter and the algorithms smarter by training themselves and training them using supervised and unsupervised machine learning to manage our false positives and have more accurate alerts, so that when the human gets involved, they're dealing with a lower volume of false positives. And so we've identified hundreds of use cases across FINRA where we're going to be enhancing our surveillance, enhancing our review of documents, and just becoming smarter and more efficient, and ultimately a more effective regulator. Because things are just so fast and so electronic in this age. We have to be a very sophisticated regulator and using modern advanced analytics tools and capabilities. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. We've been doing this for a number of years. What we did this spring is we are now getting really serious about it in terms of investment.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you for that overview. I can only imagine the challenge, given the amount of data that you have, but the importance of solving what you've articulated as that opportunity. Rob, in the minute we have left, I just wanted to ask you maybe a bit of a provocative question. Given the transformation that you have been on and the number of areas where you have helped modernize the technology footprint of FedEx, to what extent do you think sort of future-proofing is possible? Do you feel like you're getting closer to something like that? I'm sure that full future-proofing would be the famous last words for somebody to declare that a reality. But to what extent are we achieving sort of a modern technology stack that aids in the possibility of helping to develop a modicum of future proofing?
Well, as the pandemic hit us, at that point in time, everything about our business changed. And, at that point in time, you're either just faking it or you can actually do it. And so we had to pivot the business very quickly based on those capabilities that we built. So I don't know about future proofing, but we certainly didn't anticipate that. But a composable, nimble business, I still love that word, where you can put things together quickly and you're not trying to crack open, these giant silos of technology and data, really does help you with that future. And being on dominant design technologies is the only way to do that. The cities that chose not to get on the common gauge of the railroad had tumbleweeds blowing down Main Street before too long. So you have to do that journey and the hard work to get there.
Well, Steve Randich, Rob Carter, two of the deepest thinkers and most experienced technology leaders. It's a pleasure to have spoken with both of you. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom with our audience today.
Thanks, Peter.
You bet. Thank you.